Okay, I want to welcome everyone back from the break and reintroduce Susan Hurley, who is going to introduce our discussion session. She is a research scientist in the Safer Alternatives Assessment and Biomonitoring section of OEHA, and she'll provide a brief introduction to the questions that the program could use input on with regard to this planned study. I'll turn it over to Susan and then we'll have a discussion.
Okay, thanks, Meg. I think that the purpose of this afternoon discussion session is really an opportunity to delve deeper into some of the challenges I mentioned earlier, and as well as some other design issues, other issues around design and interpretation. We came up with some informal discussion questions, which I'll present on the next slides, but we welcome your input on any topics you think would be useful to discuss. Okay, I'm sorry, my slides aren't, okay, there we go. So the first question has to do with timing. As I said in my presentation, the first urine collection will be done in the morning using first morning void, but we're still trying to nail the optimal timing for the after school collection. So the question is, what is that optimal timing for that collection to best reflect the air pollution exposures that are experienced during the school day, given the biomarkers that we're looking at? And secondary to that is how should we expect diurnal variations of the various biomarkers to be considered in evaluating the optimal timing for that afternoon urine collection? And then to help with the interpretation of laboratory results, we will be administering online questionnaires. So, which topics would you consider the highest priority for inclusion on the questionnaires? I'm going to actually show on the next slide, I'll give you a list of a more detailed list of some of the topics we're currently considering, but we'd like to know if there are other factors that aren't captured on this slide that you think we should consider including. And then also, what time frame should be covered when asking about these factors? So the last two or 3 days, last week, or something else. So these are the possible question topics that we're considering for inclusion on the questionnaires. I'm not going to read through all this, but we can bring it back up when we get to this part of the discussion. But overall, we're considering topics that cover demographics, some of the characteristics of the home, some of the activities in the home, recent activities, as well as child's activities and some of their health and medication use. So I won't linger on this too long because we can bring it back up when we are discussing this. Other questions we would love some input on is how can we use biomarkers of oxidative stress and inflammation to support the interpretation of our biomarkers of air pollution exposures? So this is more of a scientific question, but then we also have the question of how to communicate the results from the biomarkers of oxidative stress and inflammation to our study participants. So that's more an issue of results return. And then because we have a very narrow time window to conduct the study, we may have to proceed even during wildfire. So under this scenario, are there any specific study design modifications we should consider? So those are some of the questions we have, but as I said, we're welcome for discussion on any topics you all think would be useful. And with that, I will hand it back over to Meg, who will facilitate the discussion section.
Oh, Meg, I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry, I'm juggling a switch in who's screen presenting and all of that. So I'm not going to show my, oops, we've got things happening here. Sorry, GoToWebinar is threatening to kick me off. So if
Ooh.
that happens, I will log me back on. It's to do with the screen sharing and giving it permission to record and things like that. Sorry for that. So I want to open it up to discussion now. We have an hour for this portion. The program is asking for lots of very specific input on these questions. And I think my preference for how to do this is that I'll leave it open at first for thoughts, and then return once people have sort of volunteered whatever thoughts they have, we'll return to the sort of organized presentation of questions to make sure that we've provided input on each of them and see if we can elicit any other responses if there's if the program isn't getting the input that you need. And so before we do this, I just want to remind everyone, we'll stick to the same sort of participation methods that we've been using. Panel members, I can see you, so you can just raise your hand. Guest speakers or program staff, if you want to speak, just turn on your webcam and you'll show up and I can call on you. Raise your hand and I can call on you. For attendees, who can't show up on webcam, if you want to speak during the discussion session, please just alert us by using the question or raise hand feature on GoToWebinar, and I will be checking in with Shobha, who's monitoring that, and we'll call on you. Then you would have to unmute yourself to ask your question or provide your comment, and then just remember to re-mute yourself once you've finished speaking. Everyone aside from panel members, you can turn off your webcam and mute yourself once you've finished speaking. So just pop on to speak. As before, webinar attendees can also submit written comments or questions via GoToWebinar or by email to biomonitoring@oehha.ca.gov, and we'll read them out loud. So that's enough of the introduction for the moment, and I want to turn it over to panel members for input and comments, or raising questions of your own, or whatever's on your mind about these study design questions. Yeah, Vina.
Thank you. On the question of the results return, I wonder if it might be helpful to do maybe a survey or a questionnaire with the parents at the start of the study to understand what's most important for them to know about the results return, and maybe ask some questions getting to this, with there's scientific uncertainty or, kind of framing out the general issue, and then asking, what kind of information would be most helpful to you, given scientific uncertainty or kind of other issues related to interpreting these results. So to maybe get a sense from the parents what they most want to know and what kind of information would be helpful to them.
Oliver.
Yeah, you also had somewhere the point diet. This is an open-ended question, or I don't know what kind of responses you expect there. This is really hard to ask people about their diet. I'm just saying that I don't think you really want to do that. It's difficult, scientifically difficult. And open-ended.
Can I ask just a clarifying question about that? Because I think it's probably worth starting a discussion about diet. Jenny had a comment earlier that we sort of deferred to this discussion session and that was Jenny's comment was more about her view that providing dietary guidance is not helpful and potentially complicating. So that's a little bit different. But Oliver, could you say more about, you know, I hear you saying that I'm just wondering if you're talking about evidence that it's really hard to get accurate dietary information, or is it hard to know what the right things are to ask? If you're talking PAH exposures, which I assume is what Susan, you're mainly interested in with dietary exposure, just that there's no good kind of measure of that bears out about dietary exposure to PAHs. Can you just elaborate a little bit, Oliver?
Oh, okay. So if that's the question, then it's different than I thought. If they like, do you burn your food? I don't know, but that might be a little easier to ask, of course, right? If that's the, you know, like, do you have it on? Do you often cook on fire and have it like barbecued in a way? That's of course easier to ask and easier to answer. If that's what's needed.
Yeah, that.
Yeah, Susan, you wanna?
Yeah, that.
I was gonna say, diet is the topic. Diet. These are not the questions on our questionnaire. These are just topics we're planning to cover, and we already have developed questions related to PAHs because of our East Bay Diesel Exposure Project. Basically, we're trying to get at, you know, and you know, we know about barbecued food. We've seen that effect where somebody ate a barbecued chicken meal in one study and they had a elevated PAH level. We're just trying to figure out, are we missing anything? Are there things that, you know, you would chime in about?
If it's a really targeted question with a really targeted answer,
Yes.
that's fine, of course.
Right, right.
Yes, Jenny.
So I had kind of a little laundry list. Is that appropriate of comments? So, one, I guess, is that especially if you're using biomarkers of late exposure, early effect, if I'm remembering right, and I apologize if I got this wrong, but you're splitting the kids into two groups, right?
Yes.
One getting the intervention, one not. I mean, to me, I think using each person as their own control for the biomarkers would be much. You get rid of a lot of variability that comes from their other exposures at home or what have you. It just seems like, had you thought about that? And you mentioned being really time limited, and I didn't understand what those limits were. Was it you only had money to go there for 1 week, or I wasn't sure what the limits were that you're saying that it was very time limited.
Well, with respect to your first question, we're really we are intending our main analysis is going to be before and after for all the kids, and not that so that second week where we have the additional standalone filtration, that will be sort of like a little mini intervention nested within our study. So the major analysis is going to focus on before and after measurements, before school and after school, so the kids can act as their own controls.
But I mean, why not have the same kids? The kids don't get the intervention, and they do get the intervention, right?
Well, the intervention may not be the best word to use here. So during the first week, actually all the kids will be in classrooms with the MERV 16 already installed. And so what we're measuring is, or what we're evaluating is, does, you know, with our biomarkers, do exposures go down after kids have been at school for a day breathing the filtered air? So just so their overall exposures go down. And then during that second week, we just have this little add-on where one of the groups has the additional standalone air filtration. So in that part, we will also be doing before and after, but we will be comparing the before and after in the kids who only have MERV 16 filtration to the group that has MERV filtration with the additional standalone. So there'll be, you know, sort of two different analyses that'll be going on there. Does that make sense, Steve?
It does. I guess I'm just I'm a little confused. I guess because I'm thinking of schools in San Diego. Lists around me are very old temporary buildings. They don't have air conditioning, a lot of them. And maybe that's not true in the Central Valley because it's so hot you have to have air conditioning. And so they don't have, a lot of them don't have good systems they could even retrofit. But is this school typical of a school? Do they usually have the MERV 16? Or I guess to me, you don't have a comparison group of a school that didn't have it, this filtration. I kind of worry that you're just going to have this. I'm not sure what you're measuring exactly. They go to school and they breathe filtered air, and it's probably a very low particulate, at least, and maybe not as low for the VOCs for the reasons they said earlier.
Yeah.
And then you're going to have an even lower, hopefully, for the VOC part with the air filtration. But I guess I'm not sure. So in my mind, I would think, oh, it'd be nice to look at the effect of the MERV 16, but you're really not, right?
Well, what we're looking, I mean, yes, we can't do our results will answer the question, does being at school, breathing filtered air, reduce overall exposures to, say, for instance, PAHs, right? I mean, yes, there could be confounding by other things that are different from them being at school versus, being somewhere else. But I actually thought you said it nicely early this morning when you said, well, when you were arguing that maybe we shouldn't be looking at, be trying to control diet, or advise them on their dietary choices, because really what we're trying to get at is this, the filtered air at school, does that actually reduce the overall kids' exposure? It would be nice to have a control group. If we had, a ton of money, then, we could have a control group in another location. Although there's always problems with then finding an appropriate control group that really doesn't have other issues where that group is different. And, there's a lot of confounding there. So
if you're taking a sample before school,
yeah,
and then after school, let's say,
right,
let's say it's an 8-hour period.
Yeah.
Then you're really looking at, using that same reasoning, you're looking at the exposures 8 hours prior to arriving at school. I mean, you're looking at that 8-hour window. You're measuring that before, presumably reflecting the 8 hours prior, and then you're measuring again 8 hours, right? So you're kind of measuring what they're exposed to between midnight and 8, or
outside of school versus inside school.
Yeah, but more specifically, within a short window of the middle of the night to early morning, right?
Yeah.
Unless you look at, it's possible, like you see in the workplace, that people's levels might go down over the week. Because
yes,
right. If it has a slightly longer half-life, it might have a cumulative effect.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking of that relative to your questionnaire. You kind of want to know, like, what happened that morning, I guess, or like how they got to school, and did they get a ride in a diesel truck, or did they walk to school next to a busy road? I'm just thinking of that specifically. And I think you're right, the timing is difficult. And I was disappointed to see you weren't measuring diesel biomarkers specifically, like 1-nitropyrene metabolites, but I assume that's because the half-life is so long that you wouldn't expect to wash out really through the week. I'm assuming that's why you didn't choose
to respond to that. No, it would totally be possible in terms of half-life, at least our understanding of 1-NP half-life. It's just feasibility of that particular analysis. It turned out to be technically very difficult, and the particular situation with the lab we just couldn't do that again. For example, it takes 100 mils of sample to do 1 MP. So yeah, it takes a lot of, and it's very, very low levels. Sorry, go ahead, Jenny. You wanted to chime in?
You're into something, especially with older kids. You can get 100 mils, but I thought ASA did it on 30 or something, 30 mils per piece.
Well, ideally, you have a large volume collection, so there's that issue. But there was just other technical issues with that method, including the fact that the levels are so extremely low that it just posed a lot of feasibility issues. So, and we had to go with also the nature of the standard agreement is, you know, the best option for us is to work with the UC. So just for a whole bunch of reasons, and yeah, limited funding and all the rest, we settled on this. We also do have, you know, in our EBJEP study, we have pyrene results, which we're going to be looking at correlations between the pyrene results and the 1MP. So we'll have some information to illuminate that. But yeah, ideally, we would have a additional biomarker more specific to diesel within the panel, but we just weren't able to do that.
Okay, so maybe I'll quickly just give you my list, because I don't want to take up too much time. But so I guess in terms of the questions, I would definitely talk about the commute to the school, how they got there would be quite important. And even if you can, like if it's a diesel vehicle or not, or something specific like that, a diesel school bus. I'm not sure how far the kids come, but I think, and when they came to school, I know a lot of kids get dropped off early for daycare before school starts, at least in our community. I would ask, of course, not just you have smoking that you're asking about, but also, cannabis smoking obviously would contribute to PAHs, and vaping, because that help you interpret the coating, vaping of nicotine in the home and in the car especially as well. And then I think that one thing you talked about fires being a big problem for your big week, but I think what's really gonna be a problem is rain in November, you know, because during rain episodes here, and I really apologize for my dog, it's just out of reach, I can't get it. During rain episodes, at least in San Diego, it's much less polluted. Typically, I know that sometimes you're offset by people heating in the air, you know, or burning stuff, but that wouldn't be as representative if you had rain for 5 days as if you didn't. So I think, to me, I think that's what you should be planning for. Wildfires are great in a sense. If they happen, you have some really interesting data, and I think you should ask for a supplement from CARB or something to even if wildfires happen before you're going to go out there, just, or even after you went, do it again quickly. Just be ready to roll. It's an unusual opportunity, you know, basically. And then my last bit of laundry list is that, have you thought about other measures that maybe you don't have to, other measures in the study, and specifically exhaled nitric oxide? And I don't know much about that except what I've read in studies, that it has the advantage in schools that you could just do it right there. You don't have to collect a sample, and the correlation with that and other markers that you're collecting might be quite interesting, because it would be more easy for community groups to use that particular measure. And then the other thing was possibly having the kids wear silicone wristbands, because they're pretty cheap to make and deploy. They're expensive to analyze, but you could just collect them. And I've had so many studies I've done where I wish I had collected certain samples. I wish I'd, you know, collected dust, or I wish I'd whatever. So I just be thinking about what else, maybe like silicone wristbands you could deploy and archive, you know, depending on what you have. And I think in terms of dietary questions, again, I do feel strongly that you shouldn't play with their diet. If it's supposed to be a real field study and what real reduction that you get, it should be just what it is, you know. And it might be difficult to give results back, like the kids of smoking parents are smoking cannabis or whatever, but from a public health point of view, it's an opportunity to educate people about exposures besides what you intended to measure, you know, that are important. But in terms of Vina's comment about how to phrase results return, you know, I do think that comparing things to a known exposure like tobacco, like, you know, kids living with a smoker have this much elevation in their oxidative markers. It's something like that is people can kind of relate to that exposure, or kids exposed to a wildfire, it's a couple wildfire studies, you know, had this much elevation. You could kind of compare it, the oxidative damage, to some other known exposures, you know, that are worse, basically, you know, that are very intense. Might be a way to go, because people have an intuitive understanding of that. Thank you for all the time and this exciting study.
Thank you for those, Jenny. Susan, so Tom, I see you have a question. We have someone in the audience who has a question, but first I just wanted to ask Susan if you have any thoughts about Jenny's suggestion about silicone wristbands and the possibility of collecting them even if you're not able to analyze them at this time. I think that's a complicated issue in and of itself, but it's maybe this is something you've already considered, or there's some parameters that wouldn't enable it. But I wonder if you have thoughts about it now. It strikes me as if you could analyze it someday, at least it's an interesting, it would provide context for the biomarkers of exposure that you are measuring and reporting. And I'd just be curious for your thoughts about it.
Well, I can say that early on in our planning stages, we did discuss the possibility of actually using the inhaled or exhaled nitric oxide measure as well as silicone wristbands. And I'm not sure on the wristbands where we landed on that. I mean, I know we ultimately didn't or aren't currently considering it. But Sarah, I don't know if you have any comments as to.
Well, yeah, it's basically in our studies, we've just done blood and urine, and we wanted to stick with urine for the study. That's the main reason. But I wondered, Jen, if you'd say why you think the silicone wristbands would be helpful. I mean, the data that I've seen, I'm not so sure, you know, that. So I'm curious of your perspective of why you think it would be useful for this study.
Well, one question is how much are they getting at home versus at the school? And it's something they could wear one overnight and then at school exchange it for another one they wore during school. And so you might have a comparison, sort of pHs, for example, of the two environments. I was thinking just as a way to collect data without a lot of difficulty, I guess, because they're so simple. So comparing the microenvironments, I guess I was thinking it's a possibility. And I'm not living or dying by this. I'm just suggesting it because it's just something that I wish I had done in a previous study. So.
Yeah, I don't know that much about them. I haven't looked deeply into them, but I'm just curious about, you know, just accuracy and use for PAHs. I don't know if you have any information on that.
I mean, my student just wrote a review article for PHs, so I can send that. Okay. It just got accepted. It's not out in press, but a couple days now it should be out in press.
Okay, cool. So we will, yeah, we'll add that to our list of things to consider. I also want to chime in and say, definitely rain. We're very well aware of the rain issue. We didn't highlight rain, partially because the panel had previously highlighted wildfires, so we wanted to acknowledge that. But we experienced that in the East Bay Diesel Exposure Project. Like, we could not change our sampling day, and sometimes we had to sample in rain, and no, we don't want to do that. So we'll be trying to plan for that as we settle on the exact days that we'll be out working. So yeah, we know it's sort of, and with Betsy knows, we've had that conversation. It wouldn't be wise to do it if it's pouring rain. I think the rainfalls actually, we're trying to pick the bad air quality period, sort of October late October, early November. Yeah, so we're partially going to have to play that by ear, but we are aware of it.
Great, thank you for that. I want to ask Shobha to let us know who because there was someone who had their hand up from well before, and then Tom.
Yeah, Junsu Park, I see you've got your hand up. I'm gonna unmute you now, so now you can unmute yourself and share your question or comment. Junsu, are you there?
Yeah, but I never raised the hand. I think it's sorry about that.
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I didn't raise my hand to ask a question. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, in that case, Tom, what did you have?
All right. Well, just one more. I know we've talked a lot about the filtering and the indoor and outdoor, but one thing, we talk about smokers, but the other thing is cooking and how people cook. And so it's not a formal experiment, but for 2 years, 2 years ago, I bought air monitors, and I have one indoors and outdoors. And I won't advertise a certain company, but in the neighborhood I live in, they have a coverage of about 200 households. And I always like to look at this every so often. And what's really interesting is, like, during the fires, I particularly watched because we have a whole house, MERV 13, and the reduction is phenomenal in what we get, but that has to do with, like, the conditions of the house and how careful we are. But one of the things when I look, normally the indoor level, so this company, which I don't know if we could mention them, right? They're so common, right? The purple air, right? But because it's so standard. But one of the things they do is they mark indoor air. They mark monitors as being indoors or outdoors, and they have a dark circle if they're indoors. So if you look at the map, and I tend to do this almost every day at different times, if you look at the map, most of the time, like 90% of the time, the indoor levels are below the outdoor levels. And I don't even know, this is just something we know, that there's a reduction due to the envelope of the building. In the evening, I see some of the highest indoor concentrations, up at the levels that are hazardous on the air pollution scale, 150, 180 EPA air quality index, which means the air quality inside these homes is as bad as it was in some of the fire communities. And it's like 3 or 4 households in this area. And I think, what are they doing? This is not smoking. This is cooking, and cooking. So anyone who cooks with oils and doesn't use, I learned this from my air quality work. It's like, you talk to Wayne Ott, he will give you reams of information and about how the best way, if you want to generate fine particles indoors, take a pan and put oil on it and fry food, because it's just a massive fine particle generator, particularly if you don't have ventilation. And I'm just saying, this is kind of anecdotally observed, but it's also been measured. So what I worry about is if there are households in your study that are frying foods or using some sort of frying, they're going to get these huge 2-3 hour exposures during the evening. And I worry that may be so high that, in the integrated daily exposure, there'd be significant reduction in the school. So I guess, the thing is, if you can't sample all the households, but if there's some way to learn a little bit more about what happens at home, you could understand some people who don't line up with the school. The school level, so, based on what I've seen from my own filtering system, a MERV 16 is just going to, unless they leave windows open or everything, a MERV 16 on a furnace system and a relatively new HVAC system is going to drop the indoor levels phenomenally, particularly in wildfires. They're just going to be way down. So there's this question about at home. beyond smoking. I mean, you could ask them if there's a smoker in the house. I suppose you could ask them how they cook food, but I don't know if that's going to tease out this huge peak that you're going to get from households that are frying food.
Susan, I noticed that on the list of questions you had about an exhaust fan, you had indoor fuel use, but what you're talking about, Tom, I think is sort of agnostic with regard to the source of the heat. You know, if you're frying oil, it could be with natural gas or it could be with electricity, and you're still going to be generating the particulate matter, and that what matters more at that point is filtration, not filtration, but ventilation from an exhaust fan, say. And Susan, I saw that on the list of questionnaire questions. So the follow-up question that I have is just, Tom, if you could choose what you would ask families to try to get at that, what would you do?
I think you could ask diet questions. I mean, what it is it's people are, you could ask them how they prepare their food. And particularly, I mean, in some households, this is breads or tortillas or things like that. People really like to fry them up, or it could be fried potatoes. But I think the question about frying is pretty important because, again, this is my observation, but there's papers that have been written by Lance Wallace, who did a fairly systematic study on different kinds of frying. And he said, actually, he measured it in different households. His own was one of the worst, because he said, we love making fried potatoes and fried tortillas and things like that. And he said he just couldn't believe how much they generated in terms of fine particles. And of course, he's breathing it. But I mean, it was fascinating because he's a very well-renowned indoor air quality person. And he said, it's short term. I mean, it's going to be during the cooking period, but the levels go way up. And then, so it's two questions. It's really, how do they prepare food? How frequently do they fry it? And I mean, baking isn't as big a problem. Well, ovens an unvented oven is also going to be an issue too, depending on where you're baking. But the big question is how well ventilated. Do they have a vent fan over their stove? Makes a huge difference.
Stephanie, did you have a point on that? And then I see Vina and Ulrika.
I'm a bit late. This is actually more to chime in on what Jenny was talking about with the kids potentially wearing the wristbands or collecting samples from them at the school. And I just wanted to mention that we worked pretty hard to ensure the confidentiality of the students at school, and that includes actually not collecting urine samples from them at the school. We had quite a few conversations around that. So I think that is probably one of the main reasons we chose not to do the wristband, since that would identify the students in the study at school.
I mean, you probably thought about this, but you can give them to all the kids in the classes, hand them out. That helps, but I think that there are some validated cooking questionnaires. Sorry, Meg, to usurp your right to tell me to speak or not. Sorry, but I just want to answer about that. There are some validated questions for cooking behaviors, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Some of the children's studies have already asked those kind of questions. Just want to say that. Thank you.
Vina?
Thank you. Yes, Jenny's last comment, I was going to say the same thing, and because it's not just do you have the stove fan, but do you use it is important as well. And my other comment is, it's a little bit off topic, but just wanted to say, I just really appreciated hearing from the community partner on this study earlier in the meeting, and thinking forward. I'm really excited about this study and the results, and I think it'd be really great to have the community partner come back to the panel to present up on the community perspective post study. I would love to see that and think about lessons learned to inform future studies.
That's a great idea.
Second that. Ulrika, you had something. Oh, you're still muted.
About that. Thank you. I was going to say, first of all, that I third that. And then next that, just with the cooking question, I mean, I think we've already talked about it a lot, but just to, I think it just really has to be during the prior day. So it doesn't have to be, how do they cook in general, but it's probably easier to answer more specific questions, like how did you cook last night? So that was really the main comment I had about that.
Thank you for that, Ulrika, because that gets to one of the questions on Susan's list, which is about timing for administration of the survey. And I'm sure this is a really tricky issue because probably the timeline for administration of the survey is going to differ for the different questions, like the ideal timing is going to differ for the different questions. But I think maybe it would be helpful to put out a little bit of that, those thoughts now to throw them into the mix, like you're saying for cooking, you really just want to know about what happened the night before the urine test. What are other timing questions that would be helpful to have input to throw in to the mix? And Susan, if you have a specific question, also feel free to just chime in. I see Jenny has an idea.
I was thinking more again about transportation and maybe how they got to school, but also do they drive a lot for games or who knows what they're playing, And then just if it is outdoor air pollution, then sports activities outside would be very important, or time outside, basically. How much time did they spend outside the day before, or the evening before after school? Did they have a outside, little league softball practice, outside? Because if they're running around outside, they're going to have a big dose to their body, and that would be different than someone that went home to an air-conditioned house and didn't go outside, So maybe wish to ask that. But I'm trying to think of the operational aspects of are you going to ask them every day, or ask the parent every morning? Or ask the parent when you pick it up, like just how do you operationally do this without being super annoying? Are you going to text them a questionnaire?
Yeah, so the way that's going to work is when they, on each sampling day, when they return their urine samples to us, we're going to give them the link to the questionnaire or a paper copy if they prefer that. And so there'll be 2 questionnaires, one on the first sampling day, one on the second sampling day. And then we're trying to design the questionnaire to capture, word it so that it captures the relevant time period. And we've been kind of struggling with that. For the biomarkers of PAHs and VOCs, we have at least a pretty good idea of what the half-lives are. So we know, we want the last 24 to maybe 36 hours. So the way we've worded it, or our current version, we're obviously just playing with this still, but we actually have some of the wording in front of me. We ask, so for things that we think affect the air quality, right? Because there's going to be different time periods depending on the category of questions, but the ones that we think are relevant to affecting their air exposures, we're asking about the past 2 days, so activities, whether it's cooking or walking to school or, being outside, all of that is over the last 2 days. And then we were thinking of saying something like the last 2 days refers to the day before you collected your child's urine sample and also the day that you collected their sample, but we don't want any information that happened after they collected their second sample, because they might not fill out the questionnaire right away. We don't want to hear that they went and played sports after school that day. So that's that's the way we're thinking of wording it. For the biomarkers of oxidative stress and inflammation, we've got other issues around timing, which I don't know if any of our guest speakers have any input on this, but for some of the health conditions or the medication use, we're not really sure what's the most relevant time window. Is it the last couple days, or is it more like the last week? So, we're still researching that, but if anyone has ideas on that, we would love to hear them.
But maybe I'm mistaken. I thought you're taking morning and later that day for more than one day in a row?
Well,
Or
it's
just
not
once?
in a row. It'll be yeah.
So I mean, is it day 1 and day 2 and day 3? So, or is it only, do they only participate once? I think I mixed up.
Okay, they participate the first week. In the first week, we're going to have one sampling day. It may not all be the same day for all kids because we logistically may not be able to get all the samples, on a Monday or whatever.
So it's only one before and after in the first week. I thought it was every day, like.
Oh yeah, no, sorry.
Okay, but yeah, I was mixed up. Okay.
Right, and then the second day won't be like back to back. It won't be consecutive days. So the second sampling day will be the following week. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, that makes sense because you're asking about 2 days prior, and I'm like, wait, if you do it every day, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it won't spill over. It won't, overlap. Right.
I can give you advice. Sorry,
go ahead, Jen.
I was just gonna, from our own studies, which are mostly tobacco related, usually try to ask questions that are general, like, does your kid use asthma medication or whatever? And then if you're doing the daily sampling, just the ones that might change. What did you have last night to eat? Did you grill or fry? Did you have a sports? So just it's very short. So you don't have data loss because it's already hard to juggle kids, school and stuff,
Yeah.
And I was just going to chime in that the reason we talk about weeks in the study is because the air sampling and monitoring will occur throughout the week. So we will be collecting the air data throughout each week, but we can only do biomonitoring on 1 day per week. So we've been working on trying to message that clearly, but obviously it wasn't completely clear. I also did want to mention to Tom, it's completely fine to talk about purple air. It was on Susan's slide. We're buying purple air. So yeah, we're we're taking advantage of those.
I have a note that Ryan Allen has a question. So go ahead and turn on your webcam and unmute yourself, and then I see Bina is up next.
Okay, I have one kind of question and one kind of comment. The comment is in terms of collecting this information about diet and medications. I'm wondering if there's any opportunity to collect it prospectively rather than retrospectively, because in my experience, people are pretty bad at remembering what has happened. But I'm wondering if maybe a few days before you could give the caregiver, a little grid to hang on the refrigerator or whatever that says just jot down, what medications. Because in my experience, when you sort of give it to them at the outset and ask them to do it prospectively, you get better information than being like, what happened last Wednesday? They're not always so good at remembering. So I don't know if that's feasible, but just a thought. And then my question, I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but I was sitting here trying to think about other exposures, not necessarily environmental exposures that might influence some of these biomarkers. And this is not my area of expertise, so I know just enough to be sort of dangerous here, but I know at least chronically that stress can be inflammatory. I don't know about more acute stress, but for some kids, school may be a stressful environment, particularly if you get sent to the principal's office or something. So you could theoretically have a situation where the school air is beneficial, but there's something else about the school environment that is harmful in terms of stress. And so you don't actually see any change because those two effects counteract each other. So I know in some of our studies for adults, we've used sort of pretty well validated measures of self-reported stress or perceived stress. That's probably a lot more tricky to do with a child. And I also don't know how well it would work for sort of more acute stress. But anyway, just a thought, if you haven't thought about it, you may want to look into sort of the acute inflammatory and oxidative effects of stress, and see if there's any way you can account for that, or if you even need to account for that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Stress wasn't actually on our radar, so we will look into that. I do know I have done some stress research, but looking at more sort of chronic levels, and I do know a lot of the there's a lot of validated questionnaires out there, but again, I think they're mostly focused on adults, and they can be fairly long. But it's a point well taken. I think we should definitely look into that.
Meg, can I just respond to one thing from Ryan? Just to clarify, Ryan, we're not doing long recall. We're doing the questionnaire the actual night of the sampling. So they immediately answer questions about what just happened, and then we do another questionnaire the following week. So they don't have to think back a week ago of what happened. It's like literally the day before. But I understand, I understand the idea of hanging up a grid to make sure you write it down and you don't forget. We did, we had activity diaries and those sort of tools for our East Bay diesel exposure project. So we could think about like a refrigerator reminder, because there are certain reminders, like reminding them, to collect your child's first morning void, to have your child tell you, hey, I need to pee, this kind of thing. So we could have a set of reminders. So that's a good idea.
I really appreciate that suggestion. Just thinking about it as a parent, not at all in my, from a scientific perspective of like, I will completely forget that something happened unless somebody says, please note if, there was an incident at home or school in the last 24 hours, we'll be asking you about that. Or whatever the questions are. Please note, these are the things we're going to ask you about. Track them, in the 48 hours before you collect the sample or whatever, if it's a grid that goes on the fridge or whatever. Just as a human and a parent, that kind of advanced notification of what I'm supposed to be paying attention to, I find enormously helpful. End of one. Vina.
Thank you. I agree with that. I can't remember anything. So, and I'm not even a parent. Well, the stress comment made me think about masks, and you're probably thinking about this already, but just who knows what the mask situation is going to be at the time you do your study, and especially if there might be wildfires, it would probably be good to collect information on masking. If I just have no idea if any of the kids might be wearing N95 type masks, but you probably want to know if that is the case. And my other comment is on the sort of question of reporting back on things that happened within a certain time. I think a visual depiction could be really helpful in addition to the verbal instructions of just like these calendar dates up to this time. It can be really helpful for people to see something visually.
I think that's an excellent idea, because we've been struggling with like how to word it. It's so cumbersome. So to have just like a simple picture, I think would really help.
I think Ulrika had something, and then I see Jenny. And then what I'll do is put the slides back up that Susan showed and kind of go through it for our last 10 minutes and see if there's things we've missed commenting on.
Yeah, I think Susan had asked about the half-life for the isoprostane and the 8-OHDG, and from what I understand, they're pretty short. So like in the blood, they could be, less like 15 to 30 minutes or something like that in that order, and maybe a bit longer in the urine, but relatively short.
Jenny.
I think one of your questions was the timing of the collection. So we didn't really answer that for the urine. I do want to talk about recess again, because I do think that if people, if kids are running around either at recess or at lunch or right after school, that's going to be an exposure source, you know, to outside air at very high breathing rates, you know, that's going to be an issue. So I almost rather see them, I mean, depending on the half-life that Ulrika was saying, I remember there was a study by, was it Sarnat, that did the commuting in Atlanta study where they took a blood sample and then they drove around in traffic and then 2 hours later took another one, and they could see, you know, increases in these inflammation markers. I forget what now, like IL-6 and something else. And, you know, so I think that I'd almost rather see collection. I'm not sure that it couldn't take place at school or near school or during lunch or even like some period of time where they're actually not exposed to outside air running around. You might be better off rather than having, like, a lot of schools for younger kids, they get out and then they stay at school for a while playing on the playground with their friends and then they go home. You know, I think as they get older, they quit doing that. They just hang around in groups. But, you know, but you know what I mean? I just feel like that's going to be a real source of confounding, if as you will. But so I almost like to see a shorter thing. And the other quick comment is that we've had good luck with text reminders. So you know, like, what time do you get up? 6:15, fine. Here's a text, 6:15, remember to get your kids' urine. I mean, you can automate them, and people really like that. They like text reminders, and they like everything by text. They don't like paper stuff anymore, to our experience.
I need to just make sure that I'm checking in with Shoba. Can you let me know if there's anyone who's queued up to speak? And also, we've done a formal call for public comment on this segment. So I want to break for a sec to do those and then show the slides.
Thanks, Meg. At this time, I'm not seeing any new comments or hands raised, but maybe we can wait for a little bit and see if anything pops up.
Maggie.
Susan, you may have mentioned this already, but do you know if there are diurnal patterns in ambient air pollutants in this study area and what they would be?
That's a good question. I don't know. My guess is that there are, and that's a good point that we should, you know, look at that ahead of time. We are going to be having, obviously, air measurements, you know, throughout the sampling time, so we will be able to account for those. But I don't know what it looks like.
Just in case that those are dominant enough to impact this kind of, you know, that it could be more important even than, you know, you're taking into account the diurnal patterns and the half-lives of the biomarkers, but, you know, that could be driving if you do see any difference in either direction. But I think we talked about this before, and is there still no opportunity for a group that kind of follows the same timeline as the kids that are in the MERV 16 school, but without that in the HVAC system, just to have, you know, if there are those patterns that are just sort of naturally occurring because of the diurnal patterns of the air pollution, then you would see that represented in those kids' samples to be able to adjust it out.
Yeah, so yeah, we can't really do that for a few reasons. One is that you know, we have to do it in a school that already has the air filtration installed, and we don't really have the budget to have a comparison somewhere else, and we don't.
Susan, I think Meg is saying a control group in a location without MERV, like to do a parallel. Isn't that what you're saying, Maggie? To do a parallel collection in a school that's similar without MERV. And what I was going to chime in and say, because something has changed, which is our money is back, our contract money is back. So before we had, you know, because the budget has been signed and our contract money was restored. So we've always been saying we don't have the money, which we did not have the money because we lost our contract money. It's now back. So I think actually I'm going to say we'll look into that idea. You know, obviously we're aware that there's not going to be, I mean, I think if we could look at patterns, you know, it's not going to be the same, right? Because this school site is very specific in terms of the impacts around that school site. So we won't have something comparable. Like at last November's meeting, we were talking about trying to find a facility where there's 2 buildings in the same location. You know, right. We're not going to have anything like that, but I'm not going to rule it out at this point, but it would be tough. But we'll definitely think about it now that we have restored funding. But I am aware that it's 410, so I'm going to pitch it back to
Marissa.
Well, that's interesting about having another school, but I wondered if also you could have, and this is a whole other can of worms, if the families have a younger child who's not in the school, so they would have the same home exposure, but then they wouldn't be going to the MER 16 building during the day, if that would be maybe a more controlled comparison.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, thanks for that idea. And that seems substantially easier in terms of recruitment and management and logistics. So that's a great idea. Thanks, Narissa.
And I think I heard in the inclusion criteria, Susan, that you're specifically saying not 2 members of the same household. And so it would just be, unless I'm remembering that wrong. I mean, no, that is not 2 kids.
Yeah, that's right. But, you know, Narissa's idea is, you know, that other child would be a different, you know, it'd be a control group. So yes, in our intervention group, we are, you know, we only want 1 per household.
Great. Jenny, why don't you go ahead with your next thought?
Just very quickly, another problem I'm sure that some of our speakers know more about than I do is, what if you have all these more people that want to participate than you have in your study? I think that's a very likely possibility at a school where the community group has got people excited about it. You know, how are you going to, or what can you offer people that you can, that want to participate, but, you know, how are you going to handle that situation? I think that's quite a likely such a scenario if it, especially at school, it's quite public, the recruitment, and people talk to each other, you know.
Yeah, we haven't had any specific discussions about that yet, but Sarah, I don't recall, was that an issue for EBDEB? And I wasn't involved in that study, so I can't comment on that.
It was not an issue. It was actually really tough to recruit children, and it took us, we actually couldn't do our study design as we planned because it took us so long to recruit. However, I think the situation Jenny's pointing to and the situation we're creating is very different because we're recruiting at 1 school. Truthfully though, our general experience in our studies, that has not been the case. I will say in East Bay Diesel, we were surprised at how many people that did volunteer wanted to volunteer for the daily samples. Like that happened really quickly. So, I mean, I think one of the things we can say is we're still going to let everyone know in the community about what the results are, particularly, you know, at a high level, summary results and all the air monitoring results. So we'll still be providing information to the community, even if their child can't participate. But yeah, like Susan said, we haven't pinned down the exact thing. I'm aware that we're just about out of time, so I think we've covered all the discussion questions pretty well. Susan, is there any last thing before we move on to the next item?
I don't think so, no.
I think it's been really valuable. A lot of great ideas.
That was going to be my question also. It turns out it's not permitting me to show my screen, so I can't do that. And someone else should reclaim the ability to be presenter because I'd have to restart my computer. So because that might be relevant in this next section. Let's see. All well, okay, I just had a little burp in my computer. It is time for us to move on to the public comment session. And as Sarah had said, depending on time, we might also use this session to return to the point about the recommendations for the legislative report, the 7th legislative report. But first, I want to make sure that we have covered any public comment. There is 15 minutes allocated for this open public comment period, which is meant to admit any comments that are on any topic related to biomonitoring California, not just to each of the sessions that we've covered today. And the same methods of submission apply as all day. You can submit written comments and questions via the GoToWebinar question feature or by email to biomonitoring@oehha.ca.gov. We'll read them aloud. You can also raise your hand using the raise hand or question feature on GoToWebinar, and we can call on you. So while Shobha checks to see if there's any public comment, I want to mention that prior to the meeting, Dr. Ahimsa Porter-Sumchai submitted a link with information from the Hunters Point Community Biomonitoring Program on several topics, including a case study of a mother and child with detection of metals in urine. And the link to that comment is available on the meeting page. It's too long to do justice to it by reading it out loud in this public comment period, but that's available on the meeting page. Shobha, is there anyone teed up for public comment?
I have 2 comments that we got earlier in the day, but no new ones I'm seeing come in at this time. Shall I go ahead and share the comments we got earlier in the day and didn't have time for? All right. One was from Nancy Biermeyer, and this is a general program suggestion on PFAS. Recent state legislation, including a ban on PFAS in firefighting foam last year and hopefully food packaging this year, may provide an opportunity to track the effectiveness of these policies. For instance, do we see a reduction in PFAS exposure to the state overall and in specific communities, particularly those close to military facilities and airports, and or who depend more on fast or other processed food that may contain more PFAS in the packaging. Hopefully this could be accomplished within the current CARE project, perhaps with just the addition of a couple of survey questions. So that was from Nancy. And the second brief comment we got was from Yolanda Sanchez earlier this afternoon. And she says, thank you for thinking about the most important, meaningful ways to provide results to participants.
Great, thank you for those comments. We really do always appreciate hearing from folks who are invested in the program. I guess here's what I think we should do, and Sarah, you can jump in if you think we need to do something else. I would like to take maybe 10 minutes that we have remaining and show the slide that I put together and with some staff about that outlines the suggestions that were discussed in the earlier session from the panel for the legislative report. And I also want to just have Shobha alert us if there is an additional public comment so that we're not closing down this 15-minute public comment session prematurely.
Agreed. I had the same thought in mind. So do you want, I was going to suggest Stephanie share her screen since, and show that slide since you were having trouble. Does that?
Yes, please. Yes.
Okay,
please.
go for it, Stephanie.
That work?
Yes.
Great.
So the point of this is just I organized into a rough priority as I felt like I was hearing them from the panel, the recommendations for the 7th legislative report that we discussed as a panel today. And let's read through them briefly and have any discussion that you want to have about them. And then I wonder if we could return, I know that staff kind of consolidated and numbered that list of comments that were gleaned from previous meetings. And if we could return to those to see if we want to grab any any of that information and add it to this list that Jenny and I will then work on writing up. So I'll just review these so that you're not trying to listen and read at the same time. The first is as a more overarching goal, mitigating environmental health inequities. And we could elaborate on this, but there's overlap with these additional recommendations. But that in general, targeting studies to identify and address disproportionate harms borne by some communities, and it could be based on geography or occupation or any number of race and ethnicity or any number of identifiers. And the second was highlighting the value of intervention studies and their ability to identify the impact of public policy or non-regulatory interventions. And the examples that Jenny gave were like carb diesel rules or the non-regulatory actions like foam replacement or air filtration like we've been discussing. That it simultaneously is a way of contributing to the goal of addressing environmental health inequities if we're looking at particularly highly impacted communities. And I think it was Vina who mentioned this notion that one of the beauties of intervention studies is they simultaneously address a community need while gathering data and getting useful information, which I think anytime that we hear from community members in the meeting, that's an often repeated request, is to not just study the population, but do something about it. And that's hard, particularly coming from the biomonitoring perspective, since it's in the nature of biomonitoring to be monitoring. But the idea of being able to design studies where we're also doing some intervention is very powerful and resonates with me based on what we hear from as community priorities. The third was evaluate exposures associated with climate change, and in a sense that's kind of organizing or framing our previous recommendation about wildfires under the kind of through the lens of climate change, but also addressing the specific chemicals exposures, whether it's particulate matter or other chemicals associated with wildfires and fires at the wildland-urban interface. Which I didn't hyphenate correctly, but and also Tom mentioned the volatile or persistent organic compounds that are whose patterns of transport and distribution are changing with climate change. The fourth is the value of non-targeted analyses, and particularly highlighting that and their ability to identify previously unrecognized pollutants. Another idea was returning to the initial sort of program priority of evaluating exposure to breast cancer relevant compounds. And finally, as we discuss these recommendations, acknowledging the gap between what is feasible and really the ultimate goal of meeting the legislative mandate of conducting statewide surveillance. So that was what I captured from this morning's conversation. And what I'd like to do is invite additions to this. And in service of that, maybe Stephanie or whoever is sharing screens could put up the consolidated slide of previously gleaned recommendations to see if we want to grab anything from that for this process. Comments, additions, suggestions from the panel? Vina.
Thank you, Meg, for putting this together. I have comments on number 5 and number 6 of that slide. On number 5, I understand this was kind of a motivation or impetus, or around when the program was formed, but I mean, I guess I wonder, the program generally hasn't had a particularly disease-focused lens, and, has thought more about kind of classes of chemicals or kinds of exposures. So it's just a question, if we're gonna call out a particular disease, maybe we should give it a little thought. If why breast cancer, not that breast cancer isn't an important priority, of course it is, but does that still make sense? Or, you know, would talking about carcinogens as a class of compounds maybe be a better recommendation? I'm not sure. That one does kind of stand out to me as a little different from kind of how the program has generally done its approach. And then on number 6, I'm not sure what the exact wording is. I haven't had time to kind of wordsmith it, but I do feel like acknowledging the sort of additional capacity that the stable funding brings, and that sort of, you know, the program's ability to advance on that goal of surveillance while not meeting it, you know, is some, we want to just reframe it a little bit. And definitely mention the stable additional funding.
Any other comments on that? I don't remember who proposed the returning to the idea of breast cancer relevant compounds. I appreciate the, Vina, your comment about, you know, one disease over another. How do we pick one over another? But if there's any reflection on that, I mean, one thing that I would say in terms of, based on my work in terms of environmental contributors to breast cancer, is that breast cancer is very much unlike other cancers in terms of the hormonal contributions to the disease. And it is getting to the top of the list, if not the top of the list, for both incidence and mortality, depending on the age group and things like that. So if one wanted to make a case for it, there may be ways of making that case, but I'm not actually advocating for that. And I just wanted to open a moment for the person who suggested it to say anything. It sounded like it was basically on the basis of it being original. Yes, Jenny.
That was me. So I think your point is well taken, Vina, and perhaps it could be expressed as endocrine, you know, affecting compounds, you know, grouping it on the compound area. You know, carcinogens act through endocrine mechanisms, or something like that. Would be a better way to put it. But I just wanted to bring it up because you know, just looking at all the different pilot studies we've had and different groups, we haven't focused on that, I think was my main point. But not to phrase it like this, I agree with you.
So in the 2 minutes that we have remaining, what has been left off this list? Because otherwise Jenny and I will just capture what's on this list, and she and I might just review the old list and see if there's something that we want to pick off. But now is your moment for the rest of the panelists to choose something else that needs to be on this list.
Hey, Meg, I want to invite you to extend if you know, we don't have to end the meeting at 4:30. We can go a little bit longer, and it seems it'll help you and Jenny quite a bit if you get a little bit more feedback.
Thank you for that.
Panel, let's just keep going for, you know, a bit longer.
Great. Okay. I didn't realize we had that flexibility. Narissa.
I just had a couple sort of random thoughts. One is I just wanted to acknowledge the role of surveillance in addressing some of these other goals, that it's not really an either or, that in order to look at things like inequities, it's really important for us to have robust surveillance, and to look at policy effectiveness, it's important for us to have robust surveillance. So I'm just cautionary about setting it up as sort of an either or sort of situation. And I also just wanted to point out, with the augmented funding, that does fall outside of the time period that's covered with this legislative report. The legislative reports also don't usually get into resource discussions, but I think Nancy's point was well taken, that we should be talking about, you know, what we can and can't do given resources. But since this does have a coverage period that ends in June and the funding doesn't start till July, we'll have to think about how we talk about that. And the final thought I had was, with climate change, the other huge impact was water availability and well waters, and the potential uptake of different pollutants to well water. And I know these are your recommendations, not mine, but I thought I would throw it out there.
Great. Given that we've had a bunch of time looking at this slide, is it possible to change back to the other list to see if there's anything there that panelists want to select to add to this list?
Sure, Stephanie can do that. I think that was in Narissa's list, right?
Yeah, I think if you go to the second page of the list I had sent you, it orders the things we've captured over the last 2 years.
Oh, so this is a single slide, Stephanie.
Yeah, I'll open up Narissa's original right now.
And was climate change on the other list? Because I thought that was wasn't that a comment that somebody wanted captured?
Climate change is number 3 on our list.
Climate change is not, oh gosh, wow. I looked and looked, but I missed the blue text. My apologies.
Is this the right page?
Thank you, Stephanie.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you for doing that on the fly.
No problem. Put it in full screen, yeah, so that it's more visible.
Yes. Second.
So these are the points that have been gathered over the past 2 years, just our recollection and summaries of the previous SGP meetings. So some of them are captured on the other slide, and of course some of the numbering is not consistent, but I guess the comparison of the two, if there are things on this list that should be migrated onto the other list.
Exactly, that was just my point, is since this was staff capturing recommendations from the panel in the past, even if they weren't in response to this question, this allows us to revisit those points and see if we want to select any of them to add to our main recommendation list. And it looks like Stephanie's trying to get it to go full screen.
Yeah, I'm having some technical difficulties, but tried to make it larger. I might have to.
Can you at least slide the slider on the bottom right-hand corner up to be a larger percent, and you might have to scroll through it?
Yes. Let's see if this helps.
Great.
For some reason it's not working for me right now, so. Oh, there we go.
Great. Thank you. So we essentially capture 1, 2, and 3 under environmental inequities, and Jenny and I can check to make sure that we're reflecting sort of the richness of that. Yes, Vina and then Jenny.
I do think number 8 remains important on the effectiveness of regulatory programs.
And do you think we didn't really capture that? I guess we referred to that, but didn't expand on it in the in our current list, but we'll make sure that we capture that. Jenny, you had something.
I just wanted to reiterate that number 4, I feel like, that we should use the amazing capacity of the laboratories and use the money for analysis and less on sample collection if possible. Given funding limitation, I just personally feel that'd be a way to continue to explore in terms of surveillance.
Carl.
Just a quick point. Everybody hear me okay? Everything's working, I think. We mentioned children this morning. I think that's terribly important. If we can protect the children, we can protect the rest of us. We know what's going on in children. We'll know what's going on in a lot of the rest of us. So insofar as it's consistent with other things, I do think that it's important to understand what's occurring to children. They're one of the most vulnerable groups anyway.
And Ulrika, you had something?
Yeah, I think also the focus on California and things that are specific to California. I mean, I think that is another really important aspect of the program that we shouldn't forget.
That's the sort of 11, focus on what makes California different.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Anything else from this list or just from your thoughts before we wrap it up? In that case, I think we should wrap it up, and I will just say that as Jenny and I work to prepare this, please, individual panel members can email individual panel members. So if you want to send me or Jenny. Yeah?
Meg, no, you can't do that because it's a series meeting, because it's the same topic.
Never mind.
This is your chance.
Okay.
And actually, before you wrap up, like you said, we should just do one last check that we didn't miss any public comment. I don't think so.
Thank you. I did with Shobha.
Yeah.
Yes.
And note there is no additional public comment.
Okay.
Okay, great. Back to you.
Vina, you had something.
Thank you. Yes, just a quick question. After the letter is prepared, will we see a draft and have just process-wise, could you say a little more about that?
Yeah, Sarah clarified this for me that because of the timing of when their legislative report is due, because it has to be done publicly, there's no way to do that before the report is due.
Yeah, unfortunately, you know, because of when it has to get into the CDPH chain in order to have a hope of having it issued by 2022, this is the time that you can provide input. And obviously we've, you know, Narissa's gathered your input over the last couple of years. So yeah, I would say try to give input now, and I think Jenny and Meg will do a good job of reflecting the panel's views.
Okay, with that and with confirmation from Shobha that there was no additional public comment, I will do what I need to do to adjourn the meeting here. Narissa, did you have something?
Nope, just popping on to say goodbye.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. So I just need to announce that a transcript of the meeting will be posted on the Biomonitoring California website when it's available. And the next SGP meeting is Monday, November 8th of 2021, and will be held via webinar again. I want to thank the staff who puts a tremendous amount of work into organizing these meetings and lining up a really interesting agenda, and also to panel members and speakers and the attendees. And with that, I'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.